Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I'm joined by our OG crew, Dr. Scott Keith,
Wow.
Rod Rosenblatt, and Adam Francisco. Today is a new beginning. It is the first episode of 2018 for the Thinking Fellows, which is pretty amazing because this started off just short of 3 years ago as kind of a little experiment at first. Hey, will this work? Let's try a podcast. And over the last 3 years, it's been incredible. We went from, a couple hundred downloads a month to thousands of people listening across the globe, not just the United States, which is pretty fantastic. It's been awesome to see the show grow because our listener base is not just silent. So sometimes, you can feel kind of stale, or is anybody listening? Are we just talking to ourselves when you do a podcast? Because sometimes it's hard to figure out what the real numbers are, but we have a really vocal audience that contacts me a lot, has a lot of conversations. I send you guys questions all the time when we get them, feedback and things like that, which we really enjoy. It really helps us improve the show. Sometimes we're able to bring those questions on the air, which we'll do next week. We have a bunch of questions that I've gathered up from listeners that we'll do on a listener question episode. And then we can also kind of feel if we're hitting the right topics, which has been pretty cool for us because we've done, 4 or 5 series now?
We did the Logi series, the Apologetic series, the Heroes of the Christian Church series, and then we've done sporadic, sort of like mini series episodes too in there. Some having to do with like vocation, others having to do with particular topics of the faith.
Yeah, so the way the show has originally gone is we've dedicated about 20 episodes to particular topics at any given point, and then we kind of ran with it, right? So we did, kind of episodic series. We're going to change it up in 2018. So this is kind of the big reveal for listeners for the new year.
Hold on to your hats,
Woo!
people.
Yeah, super exciting. So number one, we're changing new day. We talked about that in the last several episodes. Show's coming out on Tuesday mornings now, so that it's more during the prime time of your commute / downtime, lunchtime, work week type stuff. It's when, from data shows me, maybe the data's wrong, but that most listeners like to listen midweek, and so we're going to try to appeal to that in order to gain maybe audience members that haven't been able to listen back and things like that. But along with that, what we're going to do is we've covered now 100 different main topics on the show, a little more because we've done some of those mini episodes in between. And instead of recycling a series and saying, hey, let's go back and redo the Lochi series, or let's go back and redo the Apologetic series, what the plan is to do one episode within those genres every month, so that we have 4 to 5 episodes a month that we do. And so hopefully we'll get one episode on a particular apologetic question, and we'll do one episode on a particular doctrine. We'll do an episode on some on a person or some historic element of the Christian church and the faith, and then guest episodes in there as well, and kind of mix it up. That way, if, let's say, you don't want to listen to more Christian doctrine, you don't have to hear us go on for 3 months about it or block the show out for 3 months. You can just skip an episode. And
Although you shouldn't skip an episode.
That's right. You should always tune in. So we're just basing this off of stuff we've heard from listeners, and so please continue to give us your feedback. If you can tell me, I've planned out majoritively the episodes for most of the upcoming year, including some guest episodes that are going to be guests that have been on in the past that we know we're going to be able to meet up with. Some of those big ones are going to be hopefully John Pless in Norway next year again, and also at the Here We Still Stand conference in 2018 in the fall, because he'll be out there.
Yeah, I'm going out to Minneapolis in February, and I hope to wrangle Steve Paulson
Again on the show. We're hoping to have, I bet we'll have Jim Nestigan on the show again at some point this year.
I hope to wrangle him in February as well.
We're gonna meet up with him. We're just gonna have as many people as we can possibly get, because honestly, those are some of the most fun episodes, because we can kind of break up what we do with topics that people specialize in. And so you can guarantee there'll probably be some Concordia Irvine professors on the show and things like that, besides Adam. He's our resident Irvine professor, right?
Yes,
Yes.
that I am.
Hey, Adam's back.
As you can tell, today is kind of a fun episode. We're beginning the year. But I think that kind of wraps up the announcements for 2018. I just wanted to kind of stop and thank people for pushing us here. Again, we did an end of year push for donations of the show, and a lot of people stepped up and really helped us out. It's amazing to see kind of the gap of our budgetary need for the year get swallowed up by grateful donors. And
Yeah, it's great. I made a couple of personal calls right before the end of the year, and the response was overwhelmingly positive, and we're very thankful for that.
Well, the thing I found, my assignment at the San Diego conference was to talk to people and ask what they were thinking of what was going on. And I never heard a single criticism.
No, yeah.
Not
It was a
one-
great
not-
conference.
Not a one.
Even Adam had good things to say about it.
Huh.
But I got criticism, emails and phone calls.
Did you?
Oh, yeah, from a particular crowd.
No. But you thought the conference was good.
Oh yeah, the conference was great.
Yeah.
yeah,
It was outstanding. Like one of the finest conferences, actually the finest conference I've been to. Everything from food to
Food to drink to,
yeah.
yeah.
yeah, there was-
Speakers. I mean, probably should add in the speakers.
Probably should, yeah.
Well, one of the things we can add is that the conference is coming back next year, which was, we talked about it a little bit a couple weeks ago, but you can get tickets at herewestillstand.org right now. You can also,
Yeah, the sale, well, I don't know, this probably will add after the sale ends, but the sale ends into December.
yeah, so this will, because it's the first one in January.
But it's still $149 for, it's the best $149 you'll ever spend.
Yeah, if you joined us last year, you know that there was it was a good deal. There was a lot of food, alcohol, time together. There was a lot of good
Alcohol
space
consumed responsibly.
consumed responsibly.
And the spot we were in overlooking the San Diego harbor,
yeah.
Yeah, that's not too bad either.
gee, that's a nice place to suffer for Jesus.
Yep. Well, we got to do it somewhere.
And we're going to take over the recording responsibilities next time, so we don't lose podcast audio, which was an unfortunate.
Yeah, our actual audio guy, our main audio guy, is going to handle that next year instead of the other way.
Yes. So we're going to make sure that we don't lose stuff next year. So for those people who did get to join us and listen to that podcast, I hope you remember it well, because it's trapped in your memory forever. And then hopefully you can come again next year and we'll do something new. So without further ado, I think we can jump in to some of the remaining terms that we didn't get to last time. One of the big ones I think that I wanted to really hit that we didn't get to was imputed righteousness. Yeah, we talk about this on the show. We've done episodes related to this.
Rod signs his emails with it.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
So could we explain what that means, what that term means?
The reformers would have called it the gospel, and you say, well, that's got my attention. They spoke of two aspects that had to do with saving faith. The one was repentance, and Luther realized there were all sorts of labyrinth in that word, and he had to do it several times. But the other one was the imputation of the righteousness of Christ to us, and the imputation of our sin to him, the double imputation. And if you'd asked them, I'm sure they would have said, that's the gospel. And that's what Trent specifically later on said, not that, not imputed righteousness or reckoned righteousness. The righteousness of Christ reckoned to you. And that's why we have that sort of freedom to talk about what the Baptist calls assurance. Because we're really talking about him and his, not ours. And somehow, in the majesty of God, he reckons Christ's righteousness to us and remains just and the justifier of them that believe in Jesus. Now, we're talking about 3 weeks after the death of the great Reformed pedagogue R.C. Sproul. And one of the things they put up on their web was him saying in 14 different ways during different years, imputed righteousness. The
cool.
whole thing was him saying that in every way he could think of. And he's right. He's absolutely right. things like there are only two ways you're going to get into heaven. First, with your own righteousness, or with somebody else's. And I thought, I'm going to remember that one. Reckoned righteousness.
When I do this in class with the undergrads at the university, it's maybe hard to do over this isn't radio, but I'll call it radio over the radio because you can't see it. But there's this picture, and I'll usually draw it. I'm not an artist of any sort, but I'll usually draw it on the whiteboard and just like stick figures where if you have the sinner sort of standing at one corner of the board and God, sort of the eye of God looking on the sinner at the other corner of the board, you draw a cross in front of the sinner. So that when God looks at the sinner, the first thing that he sees is the cross of Christ. Mm-hmm. And based on looking at the sinner, and instead of seeing the sinner and their sin and all of their unrighteousness, seeing Christ standing in front of them, declares that sinner righteous as though that cross is theirs, because it is in Christ. And so it's this idea that your righteousness comes to you from someone who got it for you, and you get everything that is wonderful and good and holy and righteous that's his, and he takes on everything that is miserable and sinful and dirty and wretched that's yours.
Yeah, the great exchange, or the fortuitous exchange, or the happy exchange. And of course, the later Trent said that's exactly what we will never sign to, God helping us. They were lawyers, and they were interested in real righteousness and called what we were doing a legal fiction. And Bellarmine and others just picked up the pen and said, those guys think they're saved on the basis of God saying something that he knows is false. Because they were fixed on improvement. Or what's the evangelical word? Transformation.
Yeah.
Today you hear it as transformation.
They're having a hard time reconciling the grace of God and the justice of God.
Yep.
Well, I heard it accidentally this morning as I got in the car to drive down here from Big Bear, and somebody left on the station a preacher station. He was saying that same thing. I mean, it's going out in the greater LA area. This preacher is saying that if your life is not transformed, you did not hear the gospel and you are not saved.
Oh,
Ooh, we
You know?
need You Are Forgiven Radio on more time slots.
Which, people can argue that, but my question, the where the rubber meets the road on that one is who's doing the measuring of the level of transformation in my life to decide whether or not I've actually become righteous or not. It's another person. It's another sinner that's looking at me and doing the measuring. And it doesn't work. In fact, the scriptures are very clear on this, that if you try to save yourself, that is the exact problem. The exact problem is not necessarily all of your sins that we could list for all of us, liar, fornicator, whatever. The problem is at the end of the day that you are at war with God. You are a sinner, and that manifests itself in multiple attempts for you to try to save yourself.
yeah.
Right? And that you will never measure up. This is what Christ spent all the time with the Pharisees trying to explain to them. You will never measure up. You will always fall short. Even the most righteous among you is completely unrighteous in the eyes of God apart from Christ.
Yep.
He's the only one who has ever measured up. He's the only one who's ever been righteous. He's the only one who's ever walked this earth and is holy and sinless. And he gives that to you through his death and resurrection. Praise be to God.
Yep.
That's great. Yeah, I was just rereading Ferdy, Theologian of the Cross. And in the beginning there, he has the danger of a shift in language during the 20th century to where people were no longer sinners, but just...
Sinful.
Yeah, sinful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, that temptation to be glorious, you can overcome
Yeah.
it.
That's the same section in there, isn't it, where Freddie discusses the myth of the fall, as though it was something that happened accidentally, like Adam and Eve were just tooling around in the garden one day where there was a hole there that they didn't see and they fell into it. Oops, we've fallen. And it's
Good grief.
other than an active act of rebellion against God.
Yeah.
Which is what it was. So if you see yourself as somebody who's I've just accidentally fallen.
Yeah, you see yourself as a victim.
Why is God so mad at me? Or as somebody who's actually picked up the sword and went to war with God.
So this is deeply tied to anthropology.
Sure.
I mean, if you don't get anthropology right, you're not going to get probably not going to get right.
Yeah, that's what Dr. Meyer said to me one time. He thought the greatest discovery in the 16th century was a genuine doctrine of sin.
Yeah, you're never going to get this right if you think your problem is that you're just a little bit sinful.
I think there's a Reformation historian at St. Andrews named Andrew Pettigrew.
Yes.
I think it was I think that's right, grammar, who said that before the Reformation, at least one of the ways that justification or righteousness was conceived was sort of like a double entry bookkeeping.
Yeah.
With a line of debits and a line of credits, and how if you can balance that out, then you've done the best that is in you, and you're okay.
Yeah. Steve Paulson talked about that at Here We Still Stand in his little shtick on transactional theology. We tend to view our justification as a financial transaction, a bookkeeping ledger, and we're always wondering if we've deposited enough ones to make up for the deficit.
Well, and you see this right in the very beginning of the Reformation with the idea of this treasury of merits.
Sure.
Accumulated merit of all the saints. You buy an indulgence, and you can have those merits transferred from one account to your account or to your
grandfather's.
deceased relatives.
Yeah.
The priest is like licking his pencil. Okay, I need to move this one to that row.
Yeah.
We talked, this is going back probably more than a year, how interesting it is, to say the least, that the early church went astray from the doctrine of imputed righteousness so darn early.
Yep.
Yeah, I just
It took so long to recover.
It's a major argument for the difference between apostolic writings and others. And they came immediately after the death of John. And you're already starting to say, one of these pages I think is biblical, sound, and honest. And I turn the page, same author, same work, and it's goofy. What I'm reading is goofy.
Yeah, I was just reading that it was, I was not in favor of what this author said, but that Luther essentially fabricated this as a personal salvation, where before salvation was explicitly tied to participation in the church.
Communal,
Yeah, and
institutional.
so
Sacramental.
yeah, sacramental theology, different than what Luther's own sacramental theology was, but that
Participation in.
that's right.
Yeah,
The participation is the saving
counted
work.
as a good work.
That's right. And it always came back to somehow that, unlike the way we view sacraments as means of grace and outside work being acted upon us, it was your active participation in that work.
Yeah, and the priest representing you, and in some cases, Trent said, re-crucifying Christ for you in his own hands and presenting that to the Father. That's where we spoke so viciously about the Mass, was that.
Great. Well, what's interesting is this is just a couple minutes early from halftime, but we'll take just a short break. We're not going to actually pause the show. I'm going to try to roll in the break. We're going to talk about the books that the authors here have published with 1517 and how you can start getting those as a bundle pretty soon here from the 1517 Legacy website for cheaper than buying them individually off of Amazon or anywhere else. So shop.1517legacy.com. You're going to look for the Thinking Fellows bundle. In that bundle will be a copy of the second edition of Being Dad, a copy of the Resurrection Fact, which Dr. Francisco is co-editor on and author within two of the sections in there. And then Dr. Rosenblatt's Christ Alone booklet is going to be in there as well, so you'll get all three of those. Plus, while supplies last, Thinking Fellows notebook and Thinking Fellows stickers with 1517 stickers. So it's a pretty fun booklet. You get the books in there, and then you get some fun little bling in there too. So that'll be shop.1517legacy.com. I'm still working out the total price based off of shipping costs and things like that.
First 5 free.
First 5 free. Woo.
Look at
How
that.
about first 5 people that email me why they like the show and why they want the bundle? That I can use.
Caleb always restricting my grace.
That's right. The show ain't free. No, the show is free, but the stuff isn't. So yeah, so send me an email, and I guess I'll honor what Dr. Keith said here and give you a bundle for free.
There you go.
And then after those 5 are gone, you'll be able to purchase them. Shop.1517legacy.com. I'll have it on the front page by by, I don't know, the next 5 days or so.
Hey, that's a good idea, Caleb. The
Yeah.
Thinking Fellows Mundo. I like that.
That's pretty good. I'd say that we'd put the Thinking Fellows coffee mugs that we had in there, but I think there's only 2 of those left. So if you really wanted a Thinking Fellows coffee mug, now's the time to buy them too.
Because there's
While
two left.
supplies last.
While supplies last. That's again shop.1517legacy.com.
I can send them one of my personal ones if they need it.
Mine got stolen out of my office.
No.
And my office is locked. So I think I work in a communal workspace, which kills me because I'm not a communist, called WeWork.
Yeah.
And they clean up the offices, and one of the people who cleaned up, empties the trash and stuff, must have thought it was one of the mugs that belonged to the place. And I lost my dear Thinking Fellows mug.
We can have one of mine.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. Well, back to the show before we get an email that says, hey, stop talking silly and start talking about fun topics again, right? So, Adam, it's good to have you back. So I actually have some specific defining questions for you that have to do with historical periods of time. When we do, especially when we did Great Thinkers of the Christian Faith, we talked about people within particular historic points in the church. And so I thought it'd be good to kind of define what the main characteristics of each of those kind of big points are. So starting with the early church, what are the defining characteristics of the early church?
Well, it depends what we mean by early church. Are we including the apostolic era, the apostolic fathers, or so? Let's just do it very basically. The early church would be, let's call it the generation after the apostles, up until, let's say, Saint Augustine. So, 2nd century to mid 5th century. Men like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian. Origen. I
think
can
that's
make-
a workable.
plenty. Okay.
That's a
So
workable
it's
definition.
Probably the best, but not too easy guy to read on this sort of period in church history is Peter Brown, who's also a biographer of St. Augustine. The one thing that's interesting about this period in church history is you've got a lot of great figures there who, like Dr. Rosenblatt said earlier, who on one page can write wonderfully about the gospel. Then the next page they're on to some other topic about obedience that seems to contradict with
superiority of being single over being married.
Right. They're all over the place. A lot of them are millenarian.
Yep.
The church itself in those 400 years is kind of a mess.
Yeah, a lot of debate going on.
There's some would describe it, and maybe this is going too far, but I think it's Bart Ehrman, who's no friend of the gospel, calls them many Christianities. But there really are, Peter Brown puts it, micro-Christianities in the early church. It's regional, where the emphasis will be different. There's
probably one of the defining ones is Antiochian versus Alexandrian, and their Christology showed up. And they weren't exactly the same.
Right. And then throw in all the heresies, Arianism, monophysitism,
adoptionism.
It is kind of a mess. Things get cleaned up in the 320s at the Council of Nicaea, where this is Emperor Constantine, the first of the Christian emperors, along with Athanasius. I think we had an episode on Athanasius
we did.
over a year ago, and a whole bunch of others. And it's a really interesting historical episode because the people who came to Nicaea for that conference, for that council, had just come out of the great universal persecution under Diocletian. So there are some descriptions of it, of people coming who are blinded because they had their eyes plucked out, who are limping because they were beaten within an inch of their life, and they all come, and I don't know how long the council took. I probably should know. I don't know if we can know, but it took quite some time.
It did. It was long.
And that's where you get the famous episode of Saint Nick punching or slapping at least Arius.
And then Jesus
for
comes and
heresy.
visits him and says it was okay.
The result is the Nicene Creed, which is an expression of biblical doctrine.
Particularly Christology.
Yeah, focused on Christology and that which is connected to the Trinity and so on and so forth.
Yeah, if you have the JW visiting your door, they are doing what Arius did in the earliest centuries. And the answer of the church after a while was Jesus was God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made. Whatever it is to be God, Jesus was that. And that was the condemnation of the Jehovah's Witnesses of that era.
Yeah, so you get that in Nicaea, and at least what is Orthodox, small or Orthodox, is established, is confessed. And then you'll have other councils, ecumenical councils afterwards that will clean up other issues that come up that Nicaea didn't take up.
Yeah, because people end up interpreting things weird with substance
Yeah,
and all
yeah,
that.
yeah.
But, yeah.
The one thing we should not be mistaken about is Nicaea, if you will, the establishment of the canon and all that. These weren't just things that were invented in the 4th century. They were confessed from the apostolic era up until the early 4th century.
Right on.
They're clarified. They're now confessed as the doctrine of the church universally. In a Catholic way, if you will, according to the whole, right? Then, so when you get into the 4th and now the subsequent century, the 5th century with St. Augustine, that's kind of a real hinge in the history of the church. Augustine is the great church father of both the Western, that's the Roman Catholic, and the Eastern Orthodox Church. He's sort of the last of the church fathers, you could say, maybe one of the earliest scholastic theologians, call him what you want, but he's the hinge that leads us out of the Roman period into the Middle Ages. And his books, the Confessions, but probably more importantly, the City of God, next to the Bible, were the most quoted books throughout the Middle Ages. So they're
And the Reformers quoted Augustine more than any other church father.
Yeah, not too long ago, I forget who it was. Somebody wrote that Western theology, whether you like that term or not, but theology as it's done in Western Europe and in America, so Protestants and
As opposed to
Roman
the
Catholics,
East. Yeah.
are still very much tied to, have been shaped tremendously. Certainly there have been some amendments by St. Augustine, and the vision of what Christianity is, or the Christian worldview is, in the second half of that book, The City of God.
Yep.
So that right, you could say Augustine marks the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are another complicated era, the early first, up until about the 11th century. You can't say a whole lot with any sort of certainty in the early Middle Ages because there's the source material is limited.
Yeah, when people call it the Dark Ages, it's not dark necessarily because it's bloody or evil, because there's not much written, right?
It's bloody. All historical periods are bloody.
Yeah.
Barbarians who are largely, if they're not pagans, they're mostly Arians, slowly but surely get converted to Christianity. Barbarians, by definition, don't write. So we don't have a whole lot of good records, so it's hard to say. But finally we get into what we call the High Middle Ages. This is the period of, some call it the Papal Monarchy, the scholastic period of the 11th to the 13th or 14th century. That's when you think of like high medieval Catholic theology, the stuff that Thomas Aquinas asserted, that's the High Middle Ages. That doesn't mean that everything's uniform. There's still a lot of debates. There's kind of a split in the church in the Middle Ages over the side that Thomas Aquinas might represent, the more rational side to theology. And then there's the other side that you could say a guy like Bernard of Clairvaux represents, a more mystical side. They approach theology in different ways. They come to very similar conclusions, but it's high Catholic theology. This is where the doctrine of the infusion of grace is really hammered out. The doctrine of transubstantiation and the Lord's Supper is hammered out, and so on. And that will go on into the late Middle Ages. That's 13 and 1400s, where all of a sudden you've got these forerunners to the Reformation, men like John Wycliffe or Jan Hus in Bohemia, who are looking around and saying, wow, there's a lot of problems in the church. Certainly a lot of moral problems like simony and you got popes who have children. How is that when they're not married? But
priests who have children.
well, that's pretty.
How does somebody acquire children?
But it's for them it was worse. They're not like Luther and Calvin where they're going to zero in on doctrine, but they do notice there's also lots of doctrinal issues in the church. One thing that Jan Hus protested against, and it's sort of weird for us maybe today, but is the practice of communion in one kind, where it was assumed if the laity took the host, the bread,
they also
there was
got the-
blood within it. Anyway, you didn't need to give them wine or blood. So you get things like that, but that's really interesting. The 150, 200 years before Luther, you've got lots of figures who are drawing attention to the problems in the church, and usually their fate is like the fate of Jan Hus.
Yeah, burned to the stake.
Burned at the stake. Or if you're like John Wycliffe, they'll just exhume your bones and burn them and cast the ashes, and I think it's in the River Thames or one of the rivers there in England. And then you get the Luther and following, who are going to not change the character of Christianity, but they're going to recover
Very important.
classic Christianity.
Very important point.
Yeah, I mean that's the heart and soul of what the Reformers were doing. As Luther put it, 1520 or 1521, when he wrote, I believe it was his explanation of why the papal books were burned, is the title, after he burned the papal bull that excommunicated him. And he's not a book burner the way we think of book burners. He did it as a symbolic act, but he wrote that his sole purpose over the last couple of years at that point and going forward in his life was to reform the church in accordance with Holy Scripture. Not to do something new, but to realign the teachings of the church, and especially to put at front and center biblical doctrines as doctrines that are binding on Christians. Other stuff that had been sort of the product of historical, practical, can I use the word evolution here? That's adiaphora. You want to maintain, you want to keep statues in your church? Go for it. You don't want them? Fine, but they're good for devotion, or however he might argue. So you get a restoration.
He was not a revolutionary.
No, very conservative.
There were revolutionaries in his day,
sure.
but he wasn't one of them.
Yeah, one of the constant questions Luther was troubled by in his darker moments, I imagine when he's sitting by himself in his study, he would always ask himself, and sometimes he'd hear a voice, so to speak, in his head saying, are you the only one that's wise? Why is it you're the only one seeing this? How can you be sure you're right? And when Luther comes out of those dark nights, it's always because he's found the answer in Scripture. So he's not the only one. This is the teaching of the apostles, the teaching that was certified by Jesus, and so on. So you get the Reformation, and I use the word restoration earlier. Don't confuse that with the restorationist movements of the 19th century that you get the JWs and the Mormons and so on afterwards. He's restoring the church back to its original teaching, the apostolic doctrine.
No, that's pretty good.
I mean, there is about 500 years after the Reformation, even though a lot of Lutherans don't
that doesn't
recognize
count. That doesn't count.
Although I would say our show, for the most part, stops there.
I when I was at Westmont, had to teach theology after the Reformation and after the period of Orthodoxy, and I went to the registrar and I said, the name of the course I want to be The Greased Slide into Oblivion.
The grease.
Did they comply with your request?
No. She said, Rod, we can't put that in the catalog. I said, it's true. It's not false. I lost that argument.
Contemporary religious bodies, or 20th century theology, and that was it Concordia when you taught it?
But I'm reading, so we were talking before the show about Stephen Toulmin's book, Cosmopolis, where he's trying to, at least in the early chapters, explain what the Enlightenment and modernity was about. And part of his historical explanation is in the 17th century, in the context of the 30 Years' War, where at least a third of Europe's population is slaughtered, whole cities wrecked by this, in a war that was at least rhetorically over differences in Christian confessions. That doesn't mean that's the real cause, but that's at least rhetorically the cause. So you get people like René Descartes and others who are trying to figure out a way that Europeans as a society can arrive at truth starting from grounds that won't cause these theological differences. So you get the rise of rationalism and empiricism and the different variances there. But that
Trying to
what-
arrive at truth
what-
in the absence of
Yeah.
theological position or
Yeah,
true or
yeah.
false
And they
event.
build these whole ideological systems,
Systems.
or these Kant's the first to use the word worldview, Weltanschauung, right? They build these whole things on the basis of rationalism, not reason, but rationalism and empiricism. And while that's going
Rationalism
on,
as a philosophical category, not just using your head.
right, and while that's going on, the church is slowly but surely, sometimes purposely, sometimes willingly, pushed into the margins. And you get that, what's oftentimes described as the sort of fact-value difference, that in public discourse, rationalism and empiricism is what guides our conversations. When it comes to things of value or morality, the church, they can inform that stuff, but that's private. Keep it
Right.
to yourself.
Yep.
Keep that stuff
Opposite
out
of public square.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're still very
On
much...
an individual case-by-case basis.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. We're
And it's
still living in that.
Yeah,
in
it's
the wake of
easy
that.
to say you can hold any goofball personal opinion you want to. As long as you leave your neighbor alone, we don't care. And the church said, not bad, but
Right.
the Christianity's public.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the first sense of the word. The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ were public events capable of being researched.
The
So
proclamation of the gospel is a public event.
it is.
Yeah.
It's out in the public, proclaimed.
Yeah.
So private conscience or private mystical whatever in the brain, we're in the middle of that still. And there are many, many people who would love to have the whole Christian church just hold what are private opinions.
I mean, the funny thing is, there's the obvious problem theologically with that, the proclamation of the gospel and what Christ did for us,
Right.
that is a gospel, we're both public events. But the problem with believing that, believe whatever you want, hold what other values you want, just don't influence your neighbor with those,
Yep.
right? Is that never happens. We always influence our neighbors with them. And so you have to have a way of measuring, which influence is valuable and which is not, or which is true and which is false,
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, you sort of have this melee of opinions sort of just competing for public notoriety, all screaming at the same time, don't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
And it's
If you want any sort of public peace at all, like you're going to have to agree at least
Have a
on
way of
some
measuring,
points.
yeah.
You're going to have to. Yeah.
you have to have a way of measuring. So,
Yeah, I just sent one around on the secularization of the British kingdom and what that means, as opposed to in earlier eras when there was a substantial evangelical Christian presence defining the English Isles. And how far things are for them away from that now. We not so much, but on the same road. That has ramifications in terms of not just public behaviors, but mores that are worth following, or that can somehow be shown to be true somehow. And to not have them is to fall into a secularism that most see as very hopeful because of the absence of any theological claims, but it's not going to work out
but they
that
become
way.
theological claims of a
Yes,
different nature.
That's right.
With the
Nature
same-
abhors vacuums.
Yes.
That's
Including
right.
theological vacuums.
That's
And
right.
so
Yep.
you get these secular worldviews or ideologies that fill in that void,
Sure.
and then they get power.
Yep.
And I'm no postmodernist, but I think the postmodern critique on power plays predominating the public arena
Yeah,
is not maybe spot on.
I
think it is.
I just completed a pretty substantial outline of Jean Vieth's Modern Fascism. Longer than most of my outlines because I think it's an ever-present danger. And the other thing is that you can easily define what communism is because there's a real doctrine to it from Marx and others. Fascism ain't so easy.
Oh yeah.
And so I said,
I'd forgotten that about his book. That's a
I'm
good point.
gonna do that in some detail. That'll be available for cheap with a
Yeah.
whole bunch of other things.
That's a great book of his too. That's
Sure it
I
is.
think it wasn't read half as much as like Postmodern Times.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll throw that in the show notes there too. That's a good.
The time will come when my contribution to the publications is going to be my students' work me editing as general editor, but their names on these, of about 400 to 500 classic Christian writings of the West. And that'll be my contribution, and I'm simply editor. I do some of them myself, but very few. The students did the heavy lifting, and if these were published, they'd be about 3,000 to 3,500 pages if you did them in print.
Dang.
Yeah, but probably condensing 40,000 pages.
Yeah.
Well, it's they're so that you can do more than go to Amazon and see the table of contents.
Yeah.
Yep.
You can see the
Although
arguments.
you can go, if you use the outline correctly, you can go to that level
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
All right. What do you say, Caleb?
I think it's time to wrap up. This has been a great introduction to 2018. If you are new to listening to the show, if this is your first time listening to the show, or maybe the first couple times, you can always catch the show notes on your favorite podcasting app on any mobile device or the podcasting apps that are on computers. You can also catch it on iTunes, Google Play, lots of different places. Our website, thinkingfellows.com. And in those show notes, just a reminder, are links to books and other linkable material that authors have mentioned this time. I think I got about 4 or 5 written down for this episode that you'll be able to check out. Also, whatever was at the break. So, for instance, that bundle that I talked about, I'll have at least maybe a pre-order button there on that bundle up for this week. Thank you for listening. We hope you continue to join us for our 3rd year. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.